Okay, ladies and gentlemen, remember we are still dealing with scarcity, the inability of limited resources to satisfy unlimited wants and needs. And the goal is overall better, increased wealth, satisfaction, and happiness. We know that people act within their own self interest, and we know that people have choices. Those choices have costs, and rational people actually think at the margin. But now we're here at the final rule of economics. That is economics rule number 5. It is one of the most important rules that there is, and it's the concept that incentives matter. What is an incentive? An incentive is this: an action or policy that encourages individuals to act in a particular way by increasing the benefits of their actions. I'm trying to motivate you to go in a certain way with your choices. So I'm going to increase the benefit of a certain choice or a certain outcome to try to get you to move in that direction. Okay. You also have the reverse of that, which is a disincentive. A disincentive is an action or policy that discourages individuals to act in a particular way by increasing the costs of their actions. Once you start learning about incentives and disincentives, you start understanding why people make the choices they make, and you can start motivating people to act in a particular way in terms of their overall choice. So, we need to understand that people actually respond to incentives in pretty predictable ways most of the time. But just because we act, and we might say something like, well, why would you act that way? Actually, when you sit down and look at what really motivates people, you'll see that it's actually pretty predictable, and it's based on self-interest. Economic rule number 1. Like, how do you potty train a toddler? That's a form of an incentive. Incentives don't have to be really super complicated, but there are different ways to motivate, either by incentive or disincentive, a toddler to actually use a potty. All right. How do you eliminate traffic? Well, you can eliminate traffic by certain kinds of incentives and disincentives. Because eventually, if you do something like an HOV lane or greater tolls, or you charge people for how far they actually travel, then you're going to get traffic to actually go down. If you made cars less comfortable, people would drive less, and that would be an example of an incentive to deal with traffic. Then we get into things like, how do you get people to care about climate change more at the margin? And you're going to have to figure out, what are the incentives and disincentives. Obviously, when you have somebody go through a flood, wildfire, those kinds of things, all of a sudden the incentives get really, really real. But how does the average person that doesn't live through that, how do they care about climate change? And it becomes an issue of incentives. All right. The primary number one incentive that you're all familiar with is the concept of money. And monetary incentives are usually really popular, because when you give somebody money, then they are able to choose what they want to do with it. Okay. So it's super inexpensive to administer. And it gives the receiver of that money a lot of choices to whatever they want to do. You do X, I'll give you money. That's pretty simple. Or if you do Y, then I'm going to take money away from you. And then all of a sudden you feel it very directly. The problem is, of course, that money creates perverse results. Like, a lot of people will act in a predictable way when you offer them large sums of money and simply cheat the system. And we're going to see this a lot when we talk about unintended consequences. But another, example, that money doesn't always work, and is not always the end all and be all in terms of getting people to behave in a certain way. This is the fertility rate, which is the number of children had per woman around the world. And if you notice, you have this big collection of countries down here that are actually really low and continuing to go down. To have a stable economic, you know, driving force within a country, you need to have about 2 kids per woman, or overall your economy is going to start over time suffering unless you get a large group of people immigrating to your country consistently, that kind of thing. So then how do we get people to, like, how do we incentivize the idea that people should be having more children? Well, one is, of course, you could pay women or pay couples to have children. Some countries do this by offering things like tax credits. The United States does a child tax credit. So if you do that, maybe that's an incentive to have more kids. You can make it easier, cheaper to have children, like, cheaper health care or cheaper child care. You can also promote immigration, because do you want to grow that population? Then you promote, legal immigration or make it easier for immigrants to come to the country. You could also promote religion because religious societies are often have more kids. Again, it's not necessarily whether these are good or bad, but they're examples of how you use incentives to create population growth. Denmark. Denmark has a falling population, and the government decided, what if we just did an ad campaign that more people have to, have children? So they would do things like, you got to go have a romantic holiday, and they made these commercials about, oh, your mom will eventually be a grandma, and she's going to be so happy. And so they did a whole big ad campaign, and you could win diapers and strollers and stuff. Did it work? Was it a right incentive? Yeah, actually, people did. Actually, they saw that campaign, and they're like, okay, let's have more kids. And sure enough, 9 months after that campaign ran, you started to see a small little baby boom. But how do you get it to sustain over time? Those are different kinds of incentives. Okay. Now, one of the most powerful incentives that exist out there is a price, because we know a price is a measurement of value. It actually measures scarcity, but price is something else. In economics, we say a price is a signal wrapped in an incentive. Prices get people to make choices all the time. Take, for instance, here are two lemons. One is 25 cents, one is 50 cents. Which one are you going to buy? You're going to buy the one at 25 cents. Why? Because it's cheaper. Look, I just impacted a choice by making a cheaper alternative. These are both two of the same things. You're going to obviously buy the cheaper one of the two if they are exactly the same. So, what do prices incentivize? Well, if a price of something goes down, there's the incentive. It's a signal to consumers to buy more of that item because it's cheaper. If prices of something go up or down for producers, it's a different signal because the producer's not going to make as much money if the price is dropping. So the producers actually make less because that's what a lower price is signaling. Then when a market price goes up, the overall price of an item goes up, the incentive changes and shifts. All of a sudden, the signal to the consumer is price goes up, I need to buy less. While for the producer, price goes up, I need to make more. That's how I'm going to make more money. So a price in its essence does two things. One, it provides an incentive to both consumers and producers. And two, it's actually a signal that I've got to act on that. Price down, consumers buy more. Price up, consumers buy less. Price down, producers make less. Price up, producers make more. There's a signal. Okay. So now you can start getting into things like um, how do you deal with carbon? Well, if you make carbon more expensive, people will use less carbon. That's not wouldn't be very popular, but it is a way you deal with something. It also explains why eggs a few years ago went up such in price. People thought, well, companies are price gouging. No, if price of things, eggs went up in price because a lot of chickens died because of bird flu. Well, if price goes up, it's a signal to egg producers, oh, I want to produce more. Now. Same thing with avocados. Avocados are priced actually pretty high, and part of the reason they're priced pretty high is the desire for those things are really high. And so, what are people doing in Mexico more and more and more? They're growing more and more and more avocados because the signal is, well, Americans are going to eat avocados with everything, and so I want to make as much as I can. So that's how you make more money. Okay. Now, of course, when you're dealing with incentives, you can actually create externalities, sometimes positive, often negative, because you think an incentive is going to go a certain way, but it doesn't. Okay. So governments want to, of course, increase the benefit of positive externalities, and they should create policies that do that. And they want to deal with incentives that way. And they want to increase the cost of negative externalities. So they should create policies and incentives that do that too. But while sometimes they act predictably, sometimes things don't go as they were expected. And you get what are called perverse incentives. These are incentives that result in something you did not foresee, an unintended negative externality. Okay. Now, the term for an unintended negative externality is an unintended consequence. I didn't like, I create this incentive, it became perverted, and out of it came a negative externality I didn't predict, and that was an unintended consequence. You'll see this under what is called the Cobra effect. So in India during the 1700s, there was a rash of cobras that were biting kids, hurting families, and so the mayor of Mumbai says, if you give me a hood of a cobra, then I'll pay you because we want to hunt down these cobras and kill them. Well, the cobra population boomed. Why is that? Because people started taking cobras and breeding them, cutting off their hoods, and then getting money for them. Perverse incentive, money, unintended consequence, more cobras. Al Capone, where did the gangland come from? It came from prohibition. We ban alcohol, people are going to be more moral. It's going to work out great. What actually happens? Violence spikes through the air because you made alcohol illegal, but the market for alcohol is still there. So you'd had gang violence that went through the roof during the 1920s into the 1930s. Gun buyback programs, incentive. I'll give you money, you bring me your gun. They rarely ever work because what people do, they bring old guns, get money, turn around, buy new guns. That's the perverse of the incentive. Seatbelt laws. What happens when people, get hit with seatbelt laws? Well, they drive faster. The incentive, be safer. Well, yeah, it works, except people actually drive more. Bogota, Colombia wanted to get rid of its traffic, so it said you could only drive on the road every other day of the week, depending on your license plate. Sounds great. That means it should reduce traffic, right? No, people just bought two cars and got two different license plates. All right. So unintended consequences come from both, you know, incentives and disincentives. But in the end, what they're trying to do, of course, is try to motivate people's choices.